letting me interview you. And so I want to interview you about Mahatma Gandhi, and I'm going to ask you 3 questions.
Okay, go ahead.
So my first question is, what is your perspective on Gandhi and his teachings?
It's interesting that you talk about my perspective of Gandhi and his teachings, because I really learned most of those through my parents. My mom and dad grew up during the time of Gandhi, actually towards the tail end. My dad was almost 11 and my mom was just 8 when he passed away and when he was assassinated. So I didn't learn a lot. I learned a lot about from them. The teachings about nonviolence, to a certain extent the teachings of Satyagraha, because it's a Hindu concept, and of the idea that that they would use his sayings as I was growing up, or they would talk about how justly he handled the partition between India and Pakistan. It had to happen. Unfortunately, he was very sad about it, but it had to happen.
Did they care for Gandhi very much, or did they just care for him because they got independent? Did they care about him for his teachings?
The earliest remembrances I have of even bringing up these issues was because there was a Pakistan-India wars in the early 1970s, and we were in upstate New York, and so everybody would come over to watch the CBS Evening News to find out what was happening. And so they did talk about this idea. I think it was really difficult because of the partition. They were always pretty positive about the ideas of the philosophy make sense, but unfortunately the ramifications of the whole movement meant that India had to part from everybody else whom they had gotten away from the British, but then they themselves had to make a decision that was very difficult, and that was to partition the land that they had governed together, and that was difficult, I think, for my parents, because it created this. It created an adversary relationship between Hindus and Muslims, which my parents didn't feel, but it was a part of what was happening in the early 70s between India and Pakistan.
Okay, and so is that all, did you kind of follow your parents, or did you think differently about him?
I think I sort of followed my parents. It makes sense, not fighting makes sense. The way it was applied in the civil rights movement, I definitely heard more about. So the idea that you didn't fight, you fought for the things you believed in, but that you didn't use violence as a vehicle, was something that definitely was strong in what they said, and that's that value I believe in.
So is that all you want to add to the first question?
I think so. I think that's fine, and we'll follow up with the second question. Is a nice way to talk about it. I think what you might be asking me next.
So, did you learn about Gandhi in school or at home? And you obviously mentioned you learned about him at home, but did you learn about him at school?
We did. To be honest, not really. We learned a little bit in high school when they talked about when they talked about the civil rights movement in the United States and Martin Luther King, and that the fact that he used a lot of the teachings that he learned of Gandhi and nonviolence and nonviolent protest and boycotting and things like that. So we learned that much, but not much. I did spend my first year in high school in India, and to be honest, I think I just learned a little bit about that history. We learned a lot of ancient history at that point in 9th grade, so that's what we learned. So I didn't learn anything more directly there about Gandhiji.
This is a hard question, but did you, because if your parents had told you this much about him, to the certain of what he saw when it was in his times, what the streets of India would look like, was it similar when you went there in 9th grade? Was there lots of poverty or poor people?
I mean, I think that we saw a lot. Yeah, and it still is. I mean, there's quite a bit of poverty. You're talking about stories of during partition, though. When I remember reading my my grandfather's written a journal about what happened on the day that India in 1947 separated from the British. And he's written about how it was in Bombay, where he and my mom's family was. My mom was there. They did talk about a lot of the violence that was going on even during that time. People were still very upset about the idea of partition. And so he writes pretty explicitly about that. And well, Gandhi's death eventually, I mean, the idea that they had to part, people didn't agree with it and they felt like he was responsible for it. But he wasn't the only one. There are many people who were a part of that decision. One of the biggest things that happened when I was growing up also, though, is after I got back from India, almost immediately, the year after I got back in 1982, the movie Gandhi came out. And I actually went to it with my parents. And that was where they really talked far more. I learned more about the history. Just like you guys are learning in school, I did too.
Did, the partition, there was two Pakistans?
Mm-hmm.
Were they both run by the same government, or were they two separate countries?
At first they were run by the same government, and then they became separate. But part of the problem there was that they had land between them, which is very difficult to govern two places from one spot and then have India between them and other places between them. Also, in Bengal, which ultimately became Bangladesh, there was a real mix of people there. There were both Hindus and still is today. Hindus there as well as Muslims there. I think they saw themselves very differently than they saw the people who are in what is now called Pakistan. So that was a very different place, and that's what happened. Eventually, they became independent.
Do you view, because I think this might be, my question might be a bit on the extreme side, but
sure.
Do you view Pakistanis as hurtful or bad people?
Yeah.
Because they shoot Indians all the time on the border with the other guards, and India and Pakistan have had a rough relationship. Do you think it still continues now?
I think it does continue. Whether I think they're bad people, I don't. I try to judge people. I've had the privilege to be able to judge people based on, the content of their character, not the color of their skin, to quote Martin Luther, somewhat paraphrase Martin Luther King. The idea, though, is that during partition, families were separated. People lost their land if they were in Sindh, in Punjab, in Pakistan. They left and came away. They left all their land. Oftentimes, half of the family was in one place, the other half, and during that time it was extremely violent. There were very hard feelings developed. So there's very strong feelings people have against Pakistanis and Indians, and it'll eventually, my hope is as we grow up and the generations get more, that we'll let go of some of those things.
Do you believe that Indians are better than Pakistanis concerning the amount of grudges they hold?
Well, I think that it's interesting that you asked that question. I think that's a perception. The average Pakistani is trying to get through their day like the average Indian is too. I think the Pakistanis have not had as much economic development. They've had a lot more difficult political time, despite the fact that India is so huge and has its share of political problems and poverty and economic strife. But I think that the relationship is a difficult one. I don't think any one is better than the other. Everybody's trying to get through their day. They're trying to do the best by their children. They're trying to do these things. Now, that being said, there are some extremist views on both sides, and both of them are acting, and that's what we see in the news. But I'd be curious if the average day is just trying to do what we all try to do. You want your children educated. You want to put food on your table. You want to be able to be successful. All these things aren't different in each country. I don't hold that. Maybe that's because I'm an American and I was born and brought up here. It's more difficult for Indians in India because there's a lot more held history there.
It seems like the Pakistanis, they do things to Indians that sometimes make the news more than what Indians have done to Pakistan.
Well, I think that's that's a function of the news.
26/11 attacks was
Sure,
by David
sure.
Headley, who was Pakistani.
Partly.
Partly.
He's also American.
Yeah, so that was a completely different story, though he did have some ties with Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they did, I think sometimes Pakistan opens fire on Indian soldiers at the border, which has been an ongoing problem because Indians aren't even following Gandhi's point either. They're just firing back.
Well, it'd be curious. I mean, this is your question about relevance of Gandhi today. I mean, I think that we'd hope that we try and bring him about, whether you're in Pakistan or India, they both benefited from Gandhi, ultimately leaving the British. So that's a common thing that we all have. But, you know, the media is a big part of it. You're hearing a lot of what goes on in Pakistan and India because you spend time in India. The Pakistanis, I'm sure if you spend more time in Pakistan, you might hear more about Indians and the Indian, equivalent of the CIA and other things like that, having operations that go back and forth. People in Kashmir, they say there's a majority of Muslims in Kashmir, and so the majority should go to, that Kashmir should have gone to Pakistan, not to India. But because it was a Hindu kingdom, that they ended up going to India. So there's lots of arguments that go back and forth, and there are still issues between the countries. They did have in common the fact that Gandhi helped both countries get their separation from the British. So that is something in common. But you hear different. You've got to make sure that you try and look at both sides of the side of it. I think that the organization politically in Pakistan is a little bit more fraught than it is in India, but at the same time, it's pretty complex here too, or complex in India.
So it seems like Pakistanis, they're also more secretive concerning, they help people who might be, say, kind of enemies to India, or they make allies with those people, or they even this isn't a good example, but they let go when Osama bin Laden hid in their country. It just seems like they're less organized. They don't have as much security, as good as security, right, to know where he is, and I would say maybe if he was in the U.S., the U.S. could have caught him actually. Okay. And the U.S. didn't catch him when he was in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Okay. Do you want me to respond? Yeah. So I think that your feeling is probably correct. I think their economic and their political stability has been less. There are a lot of extreme groups. They're caught somewhat between a rock and a hard place. They've also got Afghanistan on one side of them, which is also extremely politically unstable and was in the middle of quite a set of disputes between the Taliban and other things. The Pakistan was sort of in between. They've got India on the other side, which is not always a very friendly person to them. So they're pretty politically unstable. They're always constantly walking a really fine line between who they support, who they do not support, because they have to function every day and with everybody. So I'm not letting Pakistan off the hook, but they're not. I mean, I think this is a lot more simple. It's not as simple as just one is right, one is wrong. Why are you supporting these people? Why are you not supporting those people? Yes, and it seems just Pakistan would hold a little bit more of a grudge just because they were the ones who got separated. They got a tinier country. They didn't get as much land as they wanted. And all these things. They might hold a grudge for that, but they also got, for the most part, they got it was a Muslim majority is how it was figured out, right, during partition. Now, there were a couple of places that there are exceptions to the rule. One is Hyderabad. Hyderabad is in the middle of India. It's in the middle, literally in the middle of India. They shouldn't be and that was a Muslim population that was greater because the Nizam of Hyderabad was Islamic. So that was the one place where they didn't get what they wanted. Kashmir. That was the exception. Kashmir became an issue, and it continues to be an issue. There's a Pakistan-occupied Kashmir that continues to be occupied by Pakistan, but the Indians don't believe that's the actual border. Now, these are the little exceptions to the rule. Given that India wasn't a standalone country before the British left, it's really hard to do this. It's really hard to make those assessments. But yeah, they might have a grudge to hold against it. India's been more successful in some sense because they've been larger and there was a greater landmass, etc. Different decisions. Some of these places have really extremist groups that then set the tone for the way that the government is run. And that makes it really difficult for the everyday person to just do what they need to do. I don't think necessarily the people are bad. It's when people come together and with the help of the government, that forms like a quote-unquote bad problem necessarily.
It's an unstable problem.
Yeah, unstable and sometimes bad.
Sometimes?
You do have some groups like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda who might go around in Pakistan.
Well, everybody has leverage in different ways, and depending on how the politics, if it's not a terribly organized political system, a stable political system. They've had dictatorships, they've had military dictatorships, they've had democracies, they've had a whole host of different kinds of political situations, and their economics as well. There's still people doing business every day. You have people manufacturing different things. You have businesses going on. But if you don't have a stable political system, it makes it very difficult to then raise all the boats up, raise all the people up.
So,
the hope is that they get some stability, and then that way the factions or the little extreme groups like Al-Qaeda or Taliban or whoever it is, these different very extreme groups who are acting extremely won't be able to act because the politics and political system will be more stable.
So thank you for letting me interview you. I think our conversation was, it went a little away from
It did.
Gandhi, but I like that we talked about partition and how India and Pakistan's relationship is.
After partition,
Yeah.
right?
So thank you again for letting me interview you, and your interview will come in handy for my project.
Excellent. Thank you.